Welcome to the show of Americans United Against Tyranny. Americans United Against Tyranny is a national organization working to restore a constitutional republic of sovereign states. And we are live on the air here this evening, courtesy of blogtalk Radio. We appreciate our brother at blogtalk, James, who has made it possible for us to share this time on air with you all. And we are going to be covering a number of different topics in this radio show over the coming weeks and months. It will be topics that cover everything from the issues that are facing us as Americans with our government, with our governments, our state governments and our federal government, with the cultural decline that is basically providing the political will for everything that is not American to be happening in America. And our intention through this program is to share ideas, to inspire people, to bring people to a better understanding of our Constitution and of the objectives of our organization, to bring them in touch with other activist agencies. We'll have guests on this show who are other patriots that are fighting for the cause of America. And we will try to always provide interesting and informative shows that encourage everyone to be engaged in this fight for our country. This is a time that is probably more critical than any before in our history, except for the Revolution, and I include the Civil War in that, because we not only are on the verge of civil war, but we are on the verge of international global world war. And the circumstances, the choices that we make as a nation in the coming months and years will determine whether or not our nation and our world will fall into a kind of tyranny that I don't believe has ever existed before. Never before in our history was it possible for tyranny to exist on a global scale, and what we see taking place in our world with both our government, world governments, what we see taking place in the Middle East with radical Islam, what we see in the dependency that we have on oil and the reluctance of our government to address that issue. All of these things present a crisis state to Americans that every one of us feel, certainly all those that are listening to this radio program, and all those that are involved in all the many, many fights that are taking place across America to combat the tyranny that is really beginning to manifest at all levels of our society and our government, from the tyranny of people who want to tell us what to eat, tell us how to think, tell us what's right, tell us what's wrong, to the tyranny of our government that wants to tell us what kind of insurance we need to buy, and also tell us what kind of food we should eat, and basically people who believe that they have some notion of how to build the perfect world, and that all they need to do is force the rest of us to agree with them. We've seen that kind of mentality several times in our recent history, and the result of it is always that millions of people end up dying. And so the fight that we're engaged in as Americans United Against Tyranny is to prevent that reality from ever happening, to keep our country focused on the ideals of liberty and justice, and to hold those accountable who fail to be responsible to those ideals. On tonight's program, we're going to be talking about a number of things. I welcome people to call into the show at any time if they want to get on with us and have a conversation within the context of the topic that we're going to cover tonight, which is what would a constitutional America really look like, to any other topic that might be on your mind, current events, what's happening with our traitorous Congress and what's happening with our traitorous president. But you're welcome to call into the show and talk with us at any time. So feel free. Call 773-897-6190. As I said, the topic for tonight's show is a constitutional America. What does it look like? And we feel it's very important to have this conversation because if we're an organization that is fighting to restore a constitutional republic of sovereign states, it's important to understand what kind of changes that would mean in the entirety of our government, because we're not just talking about electing new leaders or changing the two-party system or introducing a third party or any sort of thing like that. What we're really talking about is reversing much of what has taken place in the course of the American history, which has resulted in the tyranny that we face, an $18 trillion debt, corruption in all of the departments and agencies, the abuse of power from a president who believes that he's a king. All of these things are the eventuality of many, many years of decline. And it's important for us to understand how that decline happened. It's important for us to understand what the changes to the American government have taken place and how different the current federal government is from what we believe a constitutional model would dictate, and to understand really the form of government that our founders intended, which was a hedge against tyranny, and to understand the path that we are going to have to take as a nation to change what has been done and to substantially secure liberty and justice for not only our children, but our children's children and on into the future. I forgot to mention that I've got Ben Tierney on the show with me tonight again. Would you like to say hello, Ben?
Yes, my name is spelled differently, though. I'm not against spell.
No, it's not Ben Tierney. It's Ben Tierney. Ben is the state leader for Americans United Against Tyranny in Wisconsin, so he is the leader of Wisconsin United Against Tyranny. And we are both acting as state leaders for the organization and both working in very direct ways to build the national organization and provide the kind of service that we intend to provide to the Patriot community. Ben, would you like to say anything regarding the topic of tonight's show?
Well, I could probably talk for hours on this, but one of the things that is important, I believe, is we need to be focused on states' rights issues, because that essentially is what the founders had in mind, a collection of sovereign states. One of the beautiful things about that is if Wisconsin, for example, does something that doesn't make any sense, you're free to move to Minnesota or Illinois or anywhere else. You don't need special papers to come or go. You don't need special permission from anybody. As long as you're not incarcerated, you're free to go. And the ability for somebody to travel to, for example, Texas, where they tend to get things accurate more often, is it's a real strong pull. And I think that if we have a setup where we are seeing a return to the sovereignty of states, we will have a lot more ability to control the tyranny coming out of the federal government at whatever angle they decide to use. Whether it be President Obama creating a new tax with the stroke of a pen, or Congress not doing anything to stop them other than maybe making a couple of comments on Fox News. But like I said, I could talk for hours on this. And,
Well, you're absolutely right about the fact that the path to rein in the federal government is through the states. This is a constitutional point. The conversation that we're going to have about a constitutional America begins with a discussion about the aggregation of power. The founders understood clearly that, looking at history, that power had always been centralized in one person or in one small body of people. Whether you're talking about the senates of ancient democracies or whether you're talking about, kings that ruled, by bloodline for generations, you have in those virtually all governments in our history, it's not that you have, the lack of democracy, but democracy can in fact also be a tyranny. The old saying about, what democracy is, it's two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner. That's, the tyranny of, the potential tyranny of democracy is when the majority believes that they have, an idea that demands allegiance of all those who don't agree, and they force their will on everybody else. We are not a democracy. We're a republic. We're a democratic republic. And it means that the rights of the individual are protected over the wishes of the whole in a fundamental principled way. Our basic rights are protected, and our governments are supposed to be restrained from excessively using power to wrest away our basic rights. And that's a thing that deserves some real attention. We have circumstances where the very fabric of our basic rights are being challenged. The right to religious liberty is first one that jumps out, because what we have now is essentially a government that is trying always, much like with the Second Amendment, to restrain, to limit the free exercise of religion. And that free exercise tyranny began at the time when the 16th Amendment was passed, ratified, and the creation of the IRS created within its regulatory authority the condition for churches to establish their validity by virtue of a tax-exempt status. The tax-exempt status then becomes a stranglehold that the government holds over the church and tells them what they can speak about from the pulpit. This is a giant problem. This is an effective, tyranny of the First Amendment free exercise of religion, and it's one that certainly has to be undone. But we're talking about completely undoing the 16th Amendment, repealing it, and doing away with the IRS. The IRS as an agency as it exists today with police powers and all the other power that it controls is unnecessary. But getting back to the point is that the founders understood that power should never be concentrated in any agency, not in any government agency, and even our business laws, and the fact that we had such things as antitrust laws, which are laws that prevent businesses from becoming monopolies. A general notion in our entire law and in our Constitution that power should be separated and never be allowed to coalesce in one place, because it would certainly then be corrupted and become tyrannical. And this is evidenced in the fact that the founders not only divided power at the federal level between three branches, but they divided power between states and the federal government, and they divided power in the states between three branches. So we have power being divided all over the place. And the intention in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution statements regarding, or in the Declaration of Independence and the statements regarding that governments exist by consent of the governed, we can understand that the founders intended fully to concentrate power in the people. So if you look at really the pyramid of power, the base of that pyramid is the people. And then just above that is the state government. Between the people and the state governments, they are controlling that power pyramid all the way up to the very tippy top of it, and the last little tiny bit is controlled by the federal government in a constitutional model. The founders never intended for... Go ahead.
I was going to say, the way I've described this to people who don't follow, and I don't know how many listeners there are, but the way I've described this to people who don't follow government or political issues at all, is I say it's very much like a business deal. The states got together and decided to create the federal government, and when they did that, as business, because the founders were businessmen, the way they decided to do that was to create a contract, which is our Constitution, and it outlines the exact powers that the federal government had. They're enumerated quite clearly in Article 1, Section 8. And as any good contract, there's a give and a take. And so the states surrendered certain authorities, and those authorities are enumerated in Article 1, Section 10. Those rights that the states do not have. In other words, the state of California can't create its own currency. That's part of the Constitution. And the thing that makes America unique among nations, it may not be the only one, but it is certainly one of very few nations where the only law that exists is law that is written, and we have the right to do anything that is not illegal. Other states, other nations have the law set up where the people have to do whatever the government says. They are only allowed to do the things that the government says they're allowed to do. Here it's the exact opposite. In other words, you don't have to stop at an intersection unless there's a stop.
That's right.
It sounds funny, but it's a very important distinction. You know, if you go around the world, you'll see that very quickly we're even places like England. You know, everybody says that England is such a progressive nation that, you know, that they protect the rights of people. And there is no freedom of speech in England. People are locked up routinely for speaking. So, you know,
that's right.
We're not talking. Yeah. So, anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
That's all right. The important thing is understanding, you know, the very thing that you're highlighting, that power rests within the people. And it's only in the American system that has ever been true. The ability for Americans to decide what their government is written right into the very fabric of the Constitution. We have the ability not only to change, you know, our leadership, we have the ability to change the entire structure of our government. If the entirety of the American people, you know, came together, you know, or even 80%, some very large majority came together and said, you know, we want to redefine the Constitution, there really is no authority anywhere else to block that from happening. And really, not only, you know, in terms of, you know, the real, you know, exercise of such, you know, an action, the fact is that if there were, you know, we have 300 plus million people, and if, you know, 150 million, 200 million of those people are standing up and saying we want something, there's no force on earth effectively that can, you know, that can refuse to respond to that. And really even a much smaller percentage than that is able to, you know, affect a big change in the entire process. But the point that you're making, Ben, that power rests in the people, is the key point that I wanna highlight. The Constitution is written and very clearly, you know, establishes that this is a government by the people. Our elected representatives, and I use that word rather than leaders because they are not really intended to lead us, they are intended to represent us, are charged with the duty to go into Congress and to express the will of the people that they represent. They are there to, to move the agenda of the government in the direction that their constituents want, and then by consensus of the whole, laws are passed. And what we have today is essentially the exact opposite of that. The pyramid is flipped completely upside down. The major power exists in the federal government. The states are beholden to the government by virtue of the purse and other exercises of authority that the federal government is using against the states. And essentially, we have a centralized power system in our federal government, which has now taken on itself the authority to dictate the details of all American citizens' lives. And that model in and of itself is problematic, because the idea that any governing body would be able to establish a uniform set of rules that are going to entertain the needs and ambitions of 300 plus million people is just a ridiculous idea. And the founders understood that, and although I don't know, how many of them were able to see, America from shore to shore and being hundreds of millions of people, et cetera, I'm sure that they understood in basic principles that that it would be just as true for us today as it was for them, that power should never be centralized in any authority because it would be abused. So we have this circumstance.
A good point on that. I just saw yesterday, I think it was a highlight, I saw it, of the CPAC thing, and they had Sean Hannity was on there, and he was interviewing Rick Perry. Now, I don't know a lot about Rick Perry, but what I do know generally I like. He had made a statement, though, that was kind of frightening. They were talking about the Second Amendment rights, and he said that the states have the right to determine when and where a person can carry a weapon, but that he generally supported the Second Amendment. And to me, that was a very frightening statement. We have gotten to the point where the Bill of Rights is open to debate. It's not. But, we've gotten to a point where people, and, I have not heard Ted Cruz say anything like that, but Ted Cruz is another example to me of a very strong constitutional-minded guy, and I've never heard him say one thing that I disagree with. But, when we start saying things like, the state can determine when and where you can carry a weapon, that's not very far from them saying when and where you can speak your mind freely. That's not very far from saying where you are free to be secure in your person and your papers.
Yeah, being a Texan, I'll say, Texas is absolutely, the greatest state in the Union, as far as I'm concerned. And I say that not being a native Texan, my wife is a native Texan, but I say that because I've lived all over America, and I find that here in Texas, this is the closest thing to America as I've experienced anywhere. This place here in San Antonio is as close to what I recall as America when I was a young boy as any place I've ever been. And looking at our state government, which we worked very hard to get elected, we are confident that we've got some good representatives up there who will speak the voice of the people, and that's what they're supposed to do. About Rick Perry, I think Rick is generally a good guy. I think he's a politician, and he has played the game like many politicians have. But I believe also that Rick understands his obligation to represent the people of Texas, and he's, I think, done a fair job of that. He is, one of the things that needs to be understood about Texas is that Texas is a little bit different in terms of where the power rests in the state government. The lieutenant governor actually is a bit more powerful a person because of the role that he plays with respect to the legislature and other issues. The governor of the state of Texas is really a position that's sort of I don't want to say that it's symbolic, because it's certainly not. He has control over a lot of different departments and agencies, and does in fact have control a great deal of power. But the arrangement in terms of where the executive authority really exists is a little bit different in Texas than it is in some other states. But Texas is a great place. People in Texas love Texas. They love America. They believe in sovereignty, and they're ready to stand up and fight for it. There's no joke about it. The fact that we don't have open carry here in Texas is a hot issue with millions of people that are pushing very hard, and I expect we'll see some change in that situation before too long. But getting back to the...
I was just going to say, that's amazing, because Wisconsin actually does have open carry. Wisconsin has got a very messed up version of it. And I know I don't want to get sidetracked into a Second Amendment issue for 2 hours, but they've got a deal here where every single thing is connected to the concealed carry permit, and that's another hour and a half. We'll continue on that.
No, but you're right though, Ben. And these are examples of how little by little, with the argument of security, our freedoms are being taken away. And I want to get into a whole conversation, whether it's in this show or not, I don't know, but I want to get into a whole conversation about the whole, security versus liberty, discussion, argument. This is a, critical thing for Americans to understand. We are not intended to have a government that provides absolute peace and security for everybody. People need to understand that. The government's role is not to provide social welfare or security in any way. The government's responsibility is to provide you the security that somebody doesn't come in and shoot you, that somebody doesn't come in and steal your things, or that someone doesn't invade our country and take away our rights. The important responsibility that the government has is to defend the individual and protect his rights, and that's really the only authority that the federal government is charged with. And we were talking, about the fact that the federal government has become, that what has happened with power is that the pyramid is turned upside down, and the federal government's now in a position to try to decide citizens' lives. And I've heard this point made a number of times by talking heads, talking about, and even conservative talking heads, talking about the deadlock of Congress, how nothing is getting done in Congress. And they don't understand. They've obviously not read the Federalist Papers, because Madison was, pretty clear about the fact that really the way that the entire federal government was set up, was intended to not get much done. The requirement for a 3/4 majority to ratify any amendment to the Constitution, the requirement for a supermajority to override a presidential veto, all these things were intended to limit the expression of power. They were intended to make only what got through Congress and become law to be the thing that really satisfied the needs of a vast majority of Americans. And we can see with Obamacare that the exact opposite is true. We've got a law that has been put in place that intends to serve a very small minority of Americans, a small percentage of Americans, and it is willing to sacrifice millions of others in order to serve that small minority. This is, not to be cruel, and I want to be clear that as far as the issue of health care is concerned, I believe that we as a society are responsible to ensure that citizens are taken care of, their medical needs are taken care of, and that they have the ability to be promoted, in society, to get good educations, et cetera, but it's not the job of government to do that. The government only in the 20th century began taking on that role, and ultimately we see the end result of it is that we were $18 trillion in debt. We've got a chaotic system where fraud and waste are rife, and abuse of the system is taking place, in every possible way. The idea that you can have a government that takes $4 trillion to run it and expect that it's going to operate in any kind of efficient way is absolutely idiotic. And the point that I'm making there is that a government that requires $4.5 trillion to run means a gigantic bureaucracy. And the fact of all giant bureaucracies is that there's nothing but fraud and waste and abuse and sloth and, inefficiency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've all heard the stories about, $5,000 toilet seats and, all that sort of thing. This is what you get when you have giant bureaucracies. So the founders understood that, and they never intended for the federal government to be doing what it's doing. The federal government got into the position of doing what it's doing because not long after the Civil War and the development of the Industrial Revolution in America began moving large numbers of people into the cities and working at factories and plants and producing hard goods. The bankers and businessmen and even many in political power looked at the circumstances of what was taking place in America and began dealing with some of the challenges that interstate commerce presented, and began dealing with some of the challenges that not having a right monetary system in place and banking system in place. And so these men, in the ambition to see America grow into a very large, wealthy, powerful nation, began stretching the intention of the Commerce Clause to allow for the development of a regulatory authority to manage the business between the states, to control the banking system, and to effectively create a centralized system of commerce, a political industrial coalition that would allow for America to rapidly grow and rapidly develop the kind of power and influence that we have seen in our country, take place. And so
I have picked up, I was given this as a gift, actually. I have in my hand right now, I'm looking at it, it's a Confederate States of America $20 war bond. And it's 6 months after the ratification of Treaty of Peace between the Confederate States and the United States. That's what it says right across the top. It's a $20 war bond, basically. It doesn't say war bond on it, but that's essentially what it is. It's going to pay $20 to the bearer, and this is signed by the treasurer for the Confederacy, and it's interesting because it goes right to what you're talking about. It's about the banks, it's about the interstate commerce. And I wish David was on our call on our show tonight. He has spoken to me about and I forget what it was really called, but it's affectionately known as the wheat case. There was a farmer, I believe in Iowa, that was taken to the Supreme Court because he had grown a large crop of wheat, and he had decided to keep some of it for his own use, for stock or whatever. And the amount that he was going to keep back was enough to affect the national price of wheat. And so the Supreme Court said that he's not allowed to do that because it would affect the other growers, the other wheat growers. And so with that decision, paved a long, long list of abuses by the federal government. And it gets to what you're talking about. And
it's important to say. I'm sorry, Ben. It's important to say with regard to the Supreme Court. The founders intended for the Supreme Court to be the watchdogs, to be the people who effectively, stopped Congress and stopped the president from doing anything that violated the Constitution. And once the Supreme Court bought into the argument that that this expansion of authority through the Commerce Clause was legitimate, the Supreme Court at that point put themselves in a position walking down a road that would inevitably cause them to find themselves in a conundrum about what it means to secure liberty and justice. And that's exactly what happened with Obamacare. The federal government found themselves in a position being argued to by the executive branch that it was necessary, and the legislative branch, that it was necessary in order to impose this general tax on the entire American people, because the American people, because of the issues of health care, that this was a threat essentially to national security. That this is a problem that can potentially cause economic collapse. And in that argument that the government is there to watchdog and ensure the economic security of the American people, the American government has an expansive authority that does not line up with our Constitution, and that we see right now our Supreme Court in the throes of its own dilemma, because it has put itself in a position to have to defend not the people, but to defend the federal government, and that's a problem. So we can't rely ultimately on the Supreme Court for justice. That's an unfortunate reality. We're going to see in this current issue with respect to Obamacare whether or not Justice Kennedy has come to his senses. And ultimately the question of whether or not the court rules that this matter of the exchanges is one that the federal government has no authority to exercise, which effectively will mean the death of Obamacare. We are going to see whether or not the Supreme Court understands the jeopardy that it has put itself and the entire government, that it has put America in, the jeopardy that it has put America in with its ruling on Obamacare. This is, we're at the crossroads. We are rapidly approaching a point where in this country the obscurity of the true meaning of liberty and justice is about to put us into a position where the government begins to exercise unfettered authority. And that's the reason why Americans United Against Tyranny exists. That's why we're on this radio show talking to people who are interested in understanding what's going on. And ultimately, as you know, and I want everyone to know, when it says Americans United Against Tyranny, that's exactly what it means. We must unite. We have to fight. We have to become the united American people who have sufficient authority by our collective power to demand reform in the federal government, and not just simple reform, not just simple changing of, repealing Obamacare or those kinds of things. We're talking about restoring a constitutional America. And in our discussion in this topic,
had said the same. He on the floor. He said that he was going to be pushing for an abolishment of the IRS. That is a bold statement. That is something that we need.
Right. Well, we've got the best argument at this point in history for that. This whole business with the corruption of the IRS through Lois Lerner, and as we are about to see revealed that it goes way beyond that. We're going to be in understanding, the kind of real ugly corruption that exists in our government, and that will become, and corruption that exists in the IRS, and that will become the strong argument that Americans United Against Tyranny will be using to see that the 16th Amendment is repealed and that the IRS is abolished. We don't need
Michael, you had asked earlier about liberty and security, and for me, it's always been the true part. The true answer to that has always been that there is absolutely no security without liberty. We need to make security work within our definition of liberty. Because if we don't have the liberty to speak or to defend ourselves, and I'm not talking about me defending myself from my neighbor. That's why I hire police officers. I do that through the government. I'm talking about defending myself against tyranny, against the government. That is the entire purpose of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment clearly says that it's the security of a free state. It's about the security of a free state. It's not so I can go hunt. It's not so I can target shoot or keep my stereo safe from a prying neighbor. That is those things that, it's about the freedom of liberty. And if we don't have the security, if we don't have the liberty, rather, we have no security, because the only liberties that we've got are those that are handed to us, and those aren't liberties; those are handouts. Those are whatever the to give us.
The only real security that anyone has is the security that they provide for themselves. Ultimately, the only security that anyone has is what they will do for themselves. If you have people that love you enough to lay down their life for you, then those people are people who you can trust will provide you with security. But the idea that any agency outside of yourself is able to provide security is just fiction. This conversation, the topic of tonight's show is, what would a constitutional America look like? And the point that you're making is one of the big pieces of that description of what a constitutional America would look like. So, we've pointed out the fact that the federal government has become this overpowered and exaggerated, agency that is trying to provide us with security through an ever-expanding, regulatory authority. So let's talk about then, what if that weren't true? What would America be like if that were not the case? If we imagine that the federal government never went down that road, one of the things that has to be understood is that it is very likely that America would not have become the kind of international military power that it became. So there is a downside in some sense to think about what the truth is about America. And the reason why I say that it would not become the military power that it has become is because, the intention of the founders was that security would be provided within the states by the militia, and essentially they intended for every able-bodied person to be armed and be in a position to uphold justice and to ensure that there was security in the society. We have a tendency to think, from the point of view as Americans, we think of everything by the status quo. We have a police force that's supposed to provide us with security in our contemporary thinking. We have an army that is supposed to defend our borders. And while those things, I think, would be true in a constitutional America, the American people would not regard those things the way they do today. The ability for every person to be called into service in the time of emergency or crisis is a mentality, it's a cultural mentality that when it exists in a people, it is automatically true that they understand their responsibility. We could look at the example for example, in tribal society, it is always the case that basically every able-bodied man is a warrior. Every able-bodied man has a spear. And the idea is that, not that everyone has to walk around with a spear all the time, But the idea is that in having that consciousness in the society, everyone understands that they are responsible for every person around them, that they are a fighter for the sake of every person that exists within their community. And when we start talking about what a constitutional America would look like, it's not just a matter of looking at the change that would exist in our government. The difference, our federal government would not be the authority that it is. We would not see the arguments going on in our federal Congress about what is right for the whole American people in terms of things like insurance or any sort of thing like that. State governments, governors, and even so much as possible local governments would be about the business of managing citizens' affairs. Not too long ago, the Supreme Court ruled on the issue of pornography, that pornography is relevant to whatever local community standard exists. What is pornography in one community is not pornography in another community. And I thought that was one of the most interesting rulings that came down from the Supreme Court, because in it, the Supreme Court is essentially acknowledging that the intention of the founders was for the local people to determine what was right for them. If we consider this upside-down model of government that we have right now, where power rests in the federal government, and move it back into the place where power rests in the people, it means that in every local community, people would be deciding for themselves what was right within the guidelines of the Constitution, and not, infringing on anyone's rights in any way, under the guidelines of that Constitution. But local communities would be about the business of determining what was right for them. And states would acknowledge that ultimately the local people, the authority of the people, was authority. That when a local system decided for themselves that a certain standard was going to exist in their community, then that's the standard that would exist, and the state governments would respect that, so long as that standard did not create a problem in the context of our overriding established rights. So looking at the circumstances of what a constitutional America would look like, we see a federal government that is constrained to dealing with foreign affairs, securing our borders, fighting foreign wars, dealing with matters of state in foreign, in foreign matters, and essentially, being about the business of regulating commerce between the states, ensuring that, there was no tyranny being affected by one state against another in its commercial enterprise. But the state governments would be the real authorities. The governors of every state would essentially be, the sovereign leaders of that state, according to our system, charged with the responsibility of being, the guardians and promoters of all things good for the benefit of the people in their state. And still recognizing, the sovereignty of individuals and their responsibility to, to be good citizens and to be engaged in the business of government and in the business of their local communities. Citizenship in a constitutional America is another giant piece of the conversation, because as we import responsibility into the population, both for their government and for their communities, or the well-being of their local communities, then we see that there is a role of citizenship that is a thing that every American has to understand. And so it's easily then, it's easy to imagine then that our school systems would have a much greater focus on citizenship, and the process of education, our curriculum would include a much more in-depth study of the American ideal, the American government, our Constitution, and what it means to be a citizen in that society. That includes, personal responsibility, personal protection, and every other, facet that you can look at that is relevant to a person being essentially responsible for themselves in society. Now, it doesn't mean that, the old and the infirmed and, the people who are, orphans or people who have legitimate issues are not tended to in some context by their communities. But it does mean that it's not the government's responsibility in any way to do that. And the reason for that is based on a fundamental principle. The reason why it is not the role of government to be involved in social welfare is because when the government does that, they effectively are doing what we see now in taking from one person and giving to another, but they also are making a moral judgment. And when governments have the ability to assert moral authority, they can decide who is valid and who's not valid. The underlying principle in communism is that if you don't believe in communism, then you're not really a human being, and therefore it is opportune for the state to just get rid of you or send you off to a work camp or something like that. So establishing that
what you're talking about is actually something that I just had a conversation with tonight with my state rep about. Now, I've changed my mind on this topic, but he is right now involved in the debate between the right to work issue, where the state of Wisconsin is going to be very likely passing a law here that says that it's illegal to force an employee to join a labor union in terms of employment. Now, as the campaign was on, I was very much opposed to that law. I agree with it in principle. I don't think that I should be forced to join a union to get a job. But I also believe in the ability for the owner of a business to make a decision based on his own opinion, if that's all it is, whether it's a sound, rational decision or not. If somebody wants to make widgets for a living and they buy a company, they buy a building or they lease a building and they lease property or whatever, and they hire the people to do the work that he or she wants done, why can't they decide they want this to be a union operation? And if you want to come work for me, you're going to be in a union. The idea that the government can make a moral decision on what is and what is not a decent requirement for employment is a scary decision. Now, I've changed my mind on it. I do agree with the idea that you shouldn't be forced into a union. I'm not real comfortable with my decision either way I go with it, but I think that I think it's overall better to have the law say that you don't have to be in a union to get a job. But
the problem with unions is not in the basic idea that labor should be able to negotiate with management for wages and a legitimate piece of whatever profitability they are providing to the business. The problem with unions has to do with when they become tyrannical, when they become giant, power-mongering agencies that are effectively arguing for contractual arrangements which put the general population in jeopardy. This is the problem with what's happened with labor unions in America. They have become too large and too powerful and selfish. They are focused on, in some legitimate way, they are focused on, working deals for their union members. But when they begin working deals with local politicians to pass legislation that essentially puts the American people in jeopardy because they are beholden to through the tax system to cover these contracts that have been made between government and unions, then there's a problem. That's a corruption. That's tyrannical. We are being forced to pay for something that we don't want to pay for, and that's So the discussion in the context of, our show tonight, what does a constitutional America look like? A constitutional America looks like a place where the citizenship understands clearly enough that that sort of thing can't go on, or it will end up creating the kinds of problems that we have. Ultimately, there is no such thing as legislating right, legislating good, legislating true. There's only legislation, law only exists to serve the people, and Jesus said that plainly. The law does not, man does not exist to serve the law exists to serve man. And we need to understand that in our society, there is only, the law exists to set up boundaries. The law exists to basically establish limits. But in general, those limits have to be a part of the cultural fabric of the society. Our founders were very clear on the fact that that a free and just society meant a moral and ethical society. There is no such thing as freedom and justice without morality and ethics. Those two things, it just doesn't work. As long as you have people who are willing to affect evil in their dealings with other people, then you have a circumstance where that you have a victim and a tyrant, and there has to be somebody who steps in and stops that from happening. The idea that CEOs legitimize, the fact that CEOs legitimize their salaries at millions of times over the people underneath them is not a thing that can be controlled by legislation, by law. It's only a thing that can be controlled by moral imperative. People have to understand that to do such a thing is shameful, that it is wrong, that it's irresponsible, that it is damaging, that it effectively damages the entire notion of liberty and justice. This is the truth about what we need to understand in our society today. We are not going to right America without being a people who understand that selfishness and greed and corruption and the abuse of power are all things that demand the destruction of liberty and justice. This is the parallel of being a responsible society and a moral society and being a free and just society is absolute. There is no such thing as freedom and justice without moral responsibility. And so, when we talk about what a constitutional America would look like, the end of the conversation is that constitutional America would look like an America that is responsible, that is not dependent on government to dictate to it how to live or how to be responsible, that it is an America that is ensuring the security of its citizenship through its benevolence and charity, not through its demand that the government enforce benevolence and charity, because that never works. So in the conversation, we could talk a great deal about what the structure of government would look like, what the nature of our society would look like, what our schools would look like, what all of our institutions would look like in a constitutional America. The end of the conversation is that it would look better than it does today in every way. By being a country that is responsible to the underlying principles of the Constitution, we become a country that is exemplary in its personal character, and we become a country that is able to demonstrate to a world full of tyrants that there is a better way. When we put up that monument to America, when we accepted that gift from France in our Statue of Liberty, and we set it up and we said, this is a place for, for the people who are hungry and thirsty for liberty and justice to come and find refuge, that ideal was one that inspired people to leave their countries, to leave their cultures, to leave their modes of life, and to become American. And that is a thing that must be restored in America if we intend to see America saved. We're coming to the end of the show. Yeah, please do.
I want to say one thing. Elian Gonzalez, and that's all I'll say. I won't go into it. That's a 4-hour conversation. But Elian Gonzalez.
Yep, that's a great point, Ben. I want to thank everybody for being with us tonight. It's Americans United Against Tyranny Radio. We will be here every Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock, Ben and I, or some others of our organization. Thank you all. God bless you. Have a good night.
Good night.
Ben.
Thanks, Michael.
Have a good evening, brother.
Hey, you too. Bye.
All right.